Don't cry. We will figure this out, okay? I am right here.
I want to tell you something before this story starts. I have told you about the Vegas chapel, about the positive pregnancy test at 2 in the morning, about a lopsided birthday cake and a flower-covered kitchen, and a woman learning slowly and with enormous difficulty that loving someone meant letting them see you when you were not holding everything together. I have told you about the hospital parking lot where she cried for real for the first time in front of me. About the fish tank restaurant where James pressed his face against the glass and said fishes 17 times, and she watched our children with the expression of someone who understood exactly how lucky they were. I have told you the parts where she was strong and the parts where she was not. But I have not yet told you the part where I made a decision without asking her. This is that part. And I need you to understand something before I explain it. I need you to understand that I would make the same decision again, even knowing how it went, even knowing the fight it caused, even knowing the 3 days she barely spoke to me, and the night she slept on the couch, and the morning she came back to bed and said, I understand why you did it, but I need you to never do it again. Even knowing all of that, I would do it again. Let me tell you why. Her name was Margaret. I told you about the phone call in part 4, the unknown number on a Thursday afternoon. The careful voice, the name, the medical situation she needed Veronica to know about. What I did not tell you was what happened after I hung up. I sat in my study for 47 minutes. I know it was 47 minutes because I looked at the clock when the call ended, and I looked at it again when I picked up my phone to call Veronica. 47 minutes of sitting in the chair by the window with the afternoon light, doing what it always did in that room, and thinking about a door that had been locked for 20 years. I called Veronica. She came home in 16 minutes, I told her. What I did not tell you was what I did in the 47 minutes before I called. I called Margaret back. I know what you are thinking. That is not my call to make. That is Veronica's story, and Veronica's mother, and Veronica's 20 years of closed door, and it was not my place to call that woman back before telling my wife she had called. You are right, and I called her back anyway, because I am a person who fixes things. I spent 3 years being invisible and learning to be seen and building a life with a woman who did not know how to need people. And somewhere in all of that, I became someone who looked at a situation and thought about how to make it safer before presenting it to the person it belonged to. Which is exactly what Veronica does, which is exactly what I told her not to do, I know. But I called Margaret back because I needed to understand what I was about to hand to my wife before I handed it to her. I needed to know if this woman was safe, if her reasons were real, if the medical situation was genuine, or if it was a story designed to get through a door that had been locked for good reason. I asked Margaret 3 questions. The first was, why did you leave? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, because I was 29 years old, and I was frightened, and I made the worst decision of my life, and I have known that every day since. I said, that is not a complete answer. She said, no, it is not. She paused. I was not well. Not physically. In the way that people were not talking about in those years, the way they talk about it now. I was struggling in a way I did not have language for, and I made decisions that I would not make now, and the person who paid the most for those decisions was my daughter. I said, does she know this? She said, she knows I left. She does not know why. My second question was, what is the medical situation? She explained it. A hereditary cardiac condition. Different from what Veronica had been diagnosed with, but in the same family of conditions. Her doctors had flagged the genetic component. They needed Veronica to be tested for a specific marker that her own cardiologist may not have checked for. I said, I will have her call Dr. Singh tomorrow. She said, will she call? I said, I do not know yet. I have not told her about you. Third question. I said, if she decides she does not want contact with you, if she hears everything and she decides the door stays closed, will you respect that? Margaret was quiet again. She said yes, without question. I am not calling to reclaim anything. I lost the right to reclaim anything a long time ago. I am calling because she needs medical information and because I owe her honesty about why I left even if she never wants to see me. She paused. What she does with it is entirely hers. I said, okay. I said, I am going to tell her about this call, all of it, including that I called you back before telling her. She said, I understand. I said, she may be angry. She said that would be fair. I said, she is probably going to be angry at me first. Margaret said, are you prepared for that? I looked at the afternoon light in my study. I said, yes, I am prepared for that. I hung up. I called Veronica. She came home in 16 minutes, and I told her everything. The fight was not immediate. That was the thing about Veronica. She did not react quickly to things that were large. She processed first. The larger the thing, the longer the processing. She had been working on shortening that gap for 4 years, but some things were too big for the shortened version. She listened to everything I told her. The call from Margaret, the 47 minutes. My decision to call back. The 3 questions, the answers. When I finished, she was very still. She said, you called her back before telling me. I said, yes. She said, you gathered information about my mother and her reasons and her medical situation before you told me she had called. I said, yes. She said, you made a decision about what I needed to know and how I needed to receive it before you gave me the choice. I said, yes. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, I see, not angry. That was the part that was harder than anger. Just 2 words with something underneath them that was very large and very still. She stood up from the table. She went to the window. She stood there, the way she stood at windows when she was processing something that her usual methods were not going to be enough for. She said, I have spent 4 years working on not doing exactly that. I said, I know. She said, I have spent 4 years trying to give you information before I have processed it completely. Before I have built the architecture. Because you told me that was what a marriage needed. I said, I know. She turned from the window. She said, and you built the architecture around my mother before you told me she called. I said, yes, I did. She looked at me. I said, I know it was wrong. I know it was exactly the thing I told you not to do. And I know that knowing it was wrong does not make it right. But I need to tell you why I did it. She waited. I said, I was scared. She said, of what? I said, of handing you something that would hurt you without knowing if it was safe first. She was quiet. I have watched you carry hard things alone because you were trying to protect me. And I told you not to. And then the one time something arrived that was about you and for you, and I was the one holding it, I did the same thing you do. I assessed it first. I tried to make it safer before I gave it to you. Veronica looked at me for a long time. She said, it is different. I said, I know. She said, she is my mother. That information was mine from the moment she called. I said, you are right, she said. You had no right to speak to her before I did. I said, you are right about that too, she said. Sarah, I said, I know. I am sorry, genuinely. She turned back to the window. She said, I need some time. I said, okay. She slept on the couch that night. I did not try to change that. Some things need space to breathe, and I had used up my right to manage the space. The second day, she was quiet in the particular way of someone who is not done processing but is getting closer. She went to work. She came home. She ate dinner at the table with the children, and she talked to Elena about Gerald's recent decision to wear a paper crown that Elena had made him, and she talked to James about the fishes, which was still James's primary conversational topic. She was present with them in the complete way she always was. She did not talk to me beyond the ordinary logistics of the evening. I gave her the space. The third morning she came back to bed at 6 a.m. I was awake. I had been awake for a while. She lay down beside me. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, I understand why you did it, I said. I know it was still wrong, she said it was. And I understand why. She paused. You were trying to protect me the same way I try to protect you. And we are both still learning that protection is not the same as control. and that sometimes the most loving thing is to let the person have the hard thing directly without softening it first. I said yes. She said, "Do not do it again." I said, "I won't." She said, "I mean it, Sarah." I said, "I know, I mean it too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what she said." "All of it. I want to hear it from you directly." So I told her again everything Margaret had said. The 29 years old and frightened. The not well in the way people were not talking about. The decisions she would not make now. The worst decision of her life every day since. Veronica listened with her eyes on the ceiling. When I finished, she did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "She was not well." I said, "That is what she said." She said, "In the way she described." I said, "Yes." She said, "And she did not have language for it." I said, "That is what she told me." Veronica was quiet. "I had spent 20 years constructing an explanation for why she left," she said. "And every version I constructed involved a choice. A clear choice. A decision to leave. That meant she had weighed me against something else and chosen the something else." I said, "I know," she said. "It does not fix it, whatever was happening with her." "It does not fix what it did," I said. "No, it does not." She said, "But it is a different thing to carry than what I have been carrying." I said, "Yes, I think it is." She turned her head to look at me. "I am going to call doctor." "Sing about the medical marker." I said, "Okay," she said, "and then I am going to think about the rest." I said, "Take all the time you need." She said, "I know." She looked at the ceiling again. "Thank you for asking her if she would respect it if I said no." I said, "Of course." She said that was the right question. I said I had 47 minutes. Something moved in her expression, the beginning of something. She said, "You spent 47 minutes figuring out the right questions to ask my mother before you told me she called." I said, "I did." She said, "You are impossible." I said, "I know." She said, "Do not do it again." I said, "You said that already." She said, "I am saying it again." I said, "I heard you both times." She reached over and took my hand under the covers in the dark of the early morning. We lay there while the house woke up around us. James first, always James, the particular sounds of a 14-month-old announcing the beginning of a new day. Then Elena. Then Gerald falling off the bed, which was a sound we had learned to identify specifically. Ordinary. Extraordinary hours, Dr. Singh called back 2 days later. The specific cardiac marker Margaret's doctors had flagged was not present in Veronica's results. This was good news, better than good. It meant the hereditary component Margaret carried had not passed through in the way that would have required additional monitoring. Veronica received this information at her desk at the hospital. She called me immediately after. She said, "The marker is clear." I said, "I know." Singh called me too. She said, "He called you." I said, "You listed me as emergency contact on the updated forms last year." She said, "I know I did." I said, "Is that okay?" She said, "Yes, it is more than okay." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I have been thinking about Margaret." I said, "I know." She said, "I do not know what I want yet." I said, "You do not have to know yet." She said, "I know I do not have to, I just." I have spent 20 years not thinking about her because thinking about her was a room I did not want to go into. And now the room is open and I do not know what is in it, I said. "You do not have to go in alone." She said, "I know that too." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Elena asked me this morning why some families have grandmas and we only have one." I sat very still. She said, "I told her that families are different shapes and that our shape was still being figured out." I said, "That was a good answer." She said, "Elena said Gerald's family had a lot of grandmas." I said, "Gerald is very well connected." She said, "Apparently." She paused. "She is going to ask again." I said, "Yes, she is." She said, "I need to figure out what I want before she asks again." I said, "You have time," she said. "Not as much as I would like." I said, "No, but enough." 2 weeks after the marker news, Veronica told me she wanted to write a letter. Not meet, not call. "A letter," she said. "I need to say things in a form I can control, where I decide what is in it, and I can revise it, and I am not responding to her reactions in real time." I said, "That makes sense." She said, "I want you to read it before I send it." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, yes, I want you to tell me if I am being honest or if I am being managed. I said, those are different things, she said. I know. That is why I am asking you specifically. She wrote the letter over 3 evenings. She sat at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, and she wrote longhand, which she almost never did, and the scratching of the pen was the only sound in the house those evenings. I sat across from her working on my own things, and she occasionally looked up, and the looking up was not asking for help. It was just making sure I was still there. I was there. When it was finished, she handed it to me. I read it. It was 4 pages long. It said everything that needed to be said in the particular precise way that Veronica said things, without performance, without softening, without the architecture of concluded certainty. It said, you left, it said, I spent 20 years deciding what that meant. It said, I am learning that the stories that I told myself was missing information. It said, I do not know what I want from this. I do not know if I want anything from this. But I have children now, and they are going to ask questions, and I need to understand the answers before they do. It said at the end, I am not opening a door, I am opening a window. What happens next depends on what you do with that. I put the letter down. I said, it is honest. She said, it is not managed. I said, it is yours, all of it, no architecture around it. She looked at the letter. She said, is it okay that it is not kind? I said, it is not unkind. It is true. Those are not the same thing. She nodded. She said, I am going to send it. I said, okay. She said, I do not know what she will say back. I said, I know. She said, I do not know if I want her to say anything back. I said, that is okay too. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it and put it in the envelope she had already addressed. She said, I feel strange. I said, like what? She said, like I have been carrying a stone for 20 years and I have not put it down. But I have shifted it to a different hand. I said, that sounds right. She said, is that progress? I said, shifting which hand you carry it with is the first step to putting it down. She looked at me. She said, how are you so certain about things? I said, I am not certain about most things. I am certain about you. She held the envelope in both hands. She said, I love you, Sarah. I said, I know. I love you too. She put the letter on the kitchen counter to mail in the morning. We went to bed. Margaret wrote back. It took 11 days. The envelope was handwritten, the same careful handwriting that I now recognized from the address on the outside. Veronica found it in the mailbox on a Tuesday. She brought it inside. She put it on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a while. Elena came in from school and said, what is that? Veronica said, a letter. Elena said, who from? Veronica said, someone from a long time ago. Elena examined the envelope with the thoroughness of a 4.5-year-old. She said, is it from a good person or a bad person? Veronica looked at her daughter. She said, I am still figuring that out. Elena nodded, like this was a satisfactory answer. She picked up Gerald and went to find James. Veronica sat down at the kitchen table. She said, will you stay while I read it? I said, of course. She opened the envelope. She read it. I watched her face while she read. She was doing the stillness thing, the chosen stillness, but I had learned to read underneath it, and what I saw underneath it was not nothing, was not managed, was something that had been locked for 20 years and was looking at a window that had been opened by 4 pages of honest handwriting. When she finished, she put the letter down on the table. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, she is sorry, I said. I know, she said. She explained it. More than she explained to you. She said the particular way she was not well, and the particular help she did not get, and the particular moment she made the decision and why she made it that way. I said, okay, she said, I do not know if it is enough. I said, it does not have to be enough yet. She said, it might never be enough. I said, that is okay too. Enough is not the only option. She looked at the letter on the table. She asked if she could write again. I said, what do you want to tell her? She was quiet for a long time. Outside, Elena was explaining something to James about Gerald's paper crown. James was saying fishes, which was still his answer to most things. The ordinary sounds of our house doing what it always did. She said yes. I said yes, she can write again. She said yes, one letter at a time. I am not promising anything beyond the next letter, I said. That is enough to start. She looked at me across the kitchen table. She said, "How do people do this?" I said. "Which part?" She said, "Carry all of it, the children and the work and the medical things, and now this." "How do people carry all of it at once?" I said. "They do not carry it alone," she said. "I know. But even together," I said, "you just do, one day at a time, one letter at a time. One question from Elena at a time." She said, "Gerald has a lot of grandmas, apparently." I said, "So Priya tells me. Gerald is very socially connected." She looked at the window for a moment. The same window she always looked at when she was processing something large. "Our courtyard outside, the late afternoon light," she said. "Maybe one day Elena will too." I said, "Maybe." She said, "Not yet." I said, "Not yet. There is no rush." She turned back to me. She said, "Thank you for the 47 minutes, I said. "You said not to do it again." She said, "I know. I also know why you did it. And I know that the questions you asked were the right questions, and that you were trying to give me something safer than what might have arrived if you had not asked them." I said, "It was still not my place." She said, "No, it was not. And it was also something only you would have done." She looked at me with the expression that had no architecture, just her, just open. "You were protecting me before I knew I needed protecting." I said, "I learned from someone." She said, "Who?" I said, "A cold alpha doctor who spent 8 months watching over me before I knew she existed." She looked at me, then she laughed. "The real one, the unguarded one." I said, "Too much." She said, "Perfect amount." I said, "Are we okay?" She said, "We are always okay." She picked up the letter. "We are sometimes also complicated and occasionally infuriating. And once in a while, we do things that are the exact same wrong thing we told each other not to do." I said, "And," she said, "and we are always okay." She put the letter carefully in the drawer. Not thrown away, not filed. The drawer where she kept things that mattered and did not make a performance of keeping. I noticed. I did not say anything about it. Some things are better left as private. Elena asked about grandmas again that weekend. She asked at breakfast, matter of fact. With Gerald on her lap, and James throwing cereal at the table, and Veronica making eggs and me watching it all from the doorway with coffee in both hands. She said, "Mama, do we have a grandma on your side?" Veronica did not pause what she was doing. She said, "Maybe." Elena said, "Maybe yes or maybe no." Veronica said, "Maybe yes." "We are still figuring it out." Elena considered this. She said, "Is she nice?" Veronica said, "I hope so. Do not know yet." Elena said, "Gerald says you should find out." Veronica said, "Tell Gerald I am working on it." Elena told Gerald. Gerald's expression did not change because Gerald was a stuffed elephant. But Elena nodded like the consultation had gone well. She said, "Gerald says take your time." Veronica looked at me across the kitchen. I looked back. She said, "Tell Gerald thank you." Elena told Gerald. I drank my coffee. James threw more cereal. The morning did what mornings did. Here is what I know, now that I did not know when I sat on the floor of that Vegas chapel, in the middle of the night saying yes to a question I had not seen coming. I know that building a life with someone is not a finished thing. It is not a destination. You do not arrive and say we have built it, and now we are done, and everything from here is simple. It is an ongoing project, with new rooms that you find years in that you did not know were there. With things that arrive from outside and things that surface from inside, and things that your children say at breakfast, that send you in directions you had not planned. It is hard and it is imperfect, and sometimes you do the exact thing you told each other not to do, and you spend 3 days on the couch and you come back to bed at 6 a.m. and say, "I understand," and do not do it again. And then you keep building. Because the alternative is not building, and that is not something either of us is willing to do. Veronica got a second letter from Margaret last week. She read it at the kitchen table in the evening while I made dinner, and Elena made Gerald a new paper crown because the old one had lost structural integrity, according to Elena, who had opinions about paper crown architecture that I suspected she had inherited from her other mother. When she finished reading, Veronica put the letter in the drawer. She did not say anything about it for a while. Then she asked if she could send Elena a birthday card. I turned from the stove. She said, "Friend's birthday is in 3 weeks." I said, "I know." She said, "I told her yes." I looked at my wife at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the wood surface, and her eyes doing the processing thing, and all the weight of a 20-year closed door sitting in the room with us. I said, "Okay." She said, "Is that okay?" I said, "It is your decision, completely." She said, "I know. But I want to know if it is okay with you." I said, "Yes, it is okay with me." She nodded. Elena looked up from the paper crown. She said, "What is okay?" Veronica said, "Maybe getting a birthday card from someone new." Elena said, "Like a friend." Veronica said, "Like someone who has been away for a long time and is trying to come back slowly." Elena thought about this with the focus she brought to important information. She said, "Like when Gerald was behind the crib and you found him." Veronica was very still for 1 second. Then she said, "Yes, like that." Elena nodded. She said, "Gerald says that is okay." She went back to the paper crown. Veronica looked at me. I looked at her. I said quietly, "She is yours." She said, "I know." She looked at Elena. "She is completely and entirely mine." She picked up the letter from the table and put it in the drawer. She came to stand beside me at the stove. She put her arm around me from the side, the way she did when she was not making a production of affection, but just needed to be next to me. I leaned into her. The kitchen was warm and loud, with Elena narrating Crown construction, and James providing commentary that was mostly variations on fishes, and the evening coming in through the windows, and our life doing what it did. Ongoing, imperfect, built from the worst possible beginning, still going, still building, still yes. Every single time, still yes. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to visit my Patreon for premium full stories, exclusive videos, and private image sets made only for special members. The link is in the description and pinned comment. Thank you for supporting this romantic story world.